Please continue to enjoy your lunch. I hope you are meeting new friends and catching up with old friends. Again, it's just such a pleasure to have you here. Justice Willett, Representative James White, Representative Steve Toth, and Representative-elect Molly White. Thank you all for being here. Please give them a round of applause for joining us. It is really, as I mentioned, this is the beginning of something much, much bigger, and we're just so grateful to be able to pursue this issue. And it's really appropriate, I believe, that we focus on poverty reduction here and now, of all places and all times, because half a century ago, another Texan of the 20th century, President Lyndon Johnson, stood before the United States Congress and declared a war on poverty. It's been 50 years ago this year. This administration today, he said, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. We shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. Well, how has that war gone? As it turns out, not so well. Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation recently wrote, "We're losing that war. 15% of Americans still live in poverty," according to the official report in 2012, unchanged since the war on poverty officially began 50 years ago and about $21 trillion later. The anniversary of the launch of the Washington, D.C.'s war on poverty half a century ago coincides also with the anniversary of the launch of the First World War a century ago. And the results in grim frustration, in futile endeavors, and in hopeless outcomes are metaphorically similar. In the late 1960s, census-designated national poverty rates hovered in the 10 to 15% range, and in 2014, they're still right there. Trillions in taxpayer dollars wasted for no progress, and why is the issue of poverty so intractable? But maybe, just maybe, Washington, D.C. might have the wrong answer to impoverishment and deprivation in the great country of America. Maybe the big government programs and the big spending isn't the right answer. Could it be that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are truly the best anti-poverty programs of all? The Texas example and the Texas model give us a promising look at just what happens when prosperity and poverty, when Americans are allowed to be free. The latest U.S. Census data offer an instructive comparison. And if you heard the panels this morning, you heard Chuck and several others talk about this, but it is so important because it gives us such a clear picture of what exactly is happening. California and Texas are the first and second most populous states, respectively. They are minority-majority states. Both states have 38% of the population as Hispanic. 12% of Texans are African American, 7% Californians are African American, and both states boast big, big economies. But yet, California has 47% more people living in poverty than does Texas. 47% more people. With 1/8 of the American population, California has 1/3 of the nation's welfare recipients. And in 2011, California's state and local taxes were a whopping 52% higher as a share of income than here in Texas. Texas, with lower taxes, lower government spending, and much less of a welfare state, also has far less poverty than California, just as California has pursued the same D.C. model of a war on poverty. In other words, Texas isn't just a place where we're all more free. Texas is a place where more freedom means less poverty. Fortunately, it hasn't eluded the people of Texas. You may have heard that we released a major poll this morning, commissioned over the last few weeks, a poll that we talked to many Texans across the political spectrum. And I want to share a few of the takeaways because it's incredibly instructive on Texans' attitudes towards poverty, towards prosperity, and towards government. 89% of Texans Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, believe that focusing on growing the economy to provide job opportunities is the best way to combat poverty. 91% of all Texans believe a growing economy would help reduce poverty. And 87% of all Texans believe that better educational opportunities through more school choice would help reduce poverty. What do these numbers mean? Well, I think it's pretty simple and clear. What we see in these numbers is simply an affirmation of the traditional American dream, that hard work, individual initiative, neighborly charity, and limited government are indeed the ways to create prosperity and reduce poverty in every single community. Texans understand what Americans have always known, but what Washington, D.C. has forgotten, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not big government and more spending, are the means for lifting up those who are the least among us. I'd like to close with just a short story and then introduce you to our star of the day, whom you will adore if you haven't already gotten to hear him. This is the tale of a little boy whose family was always on the edge of ruin. He was born in a hard-scrabble small town in an apartment above a general store. His father was an itinerant salesman and an alcoholic. It was a difficult home life, spare and straightened and stressed and never with much. And the boy learned that if he wanted to keep his few pennies safe, he had to hide them under a loose brick in the fireplace. But despite having so little, he dreamed of so very much, because this little boy lived in an America where having nothing was no barrier to achieving everything. And when Ronald Reagan returned to his boyhood home in Tampico, Illinois, as President of the United States, he went straight to that little home and went straight to that loose brick in the fireplace, pulled it up, and collected the pennies underneath. That is the America that he had. That is the America that we defend every day, and it is the America that we will continue to work to rebuild. And it starts here. So I thank you so very, very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Our guest speaker today is one of the great heroes, I believe, of our movement, and someone that has had such an important voice in what all of these issues mean and in truly helping to defend what is great about this country. Reverend Robert Sirico is the president and co-founder of the Acton Institute and the pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish, both in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Of course, a regular writer and commentator on religious, political, economic, and social issues. You've seen him in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Washington Times, just to name a very, very few. And his most recent book, Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy, Reverend Sirico shows and tells us how a free economy is not only the best way to meet society's needs, but also the surest protection of human dignity. Please help me welcome our guest speaker for today, Father Sirico.
Thank you so much, Brooke. It's so delightful to be back in Texas. It's a real breath of fresh air, and one of the first things I want to say is how proud I am to be here with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I mentioned in a small reception earlier that I consider us kissing cousins. We began our efforts at about the same time. You're just celebrating your 25th anniversary, and we will be next year. And we feel ourselves comrades in the struggle for freedom. I'm also delighted to be here because next week, the Acton Institute has a new film that is going to be shown at the Austin Film Festival here. We can't show you the film because it is embargoed, because it's going through this film contest process. A few weeks ago, it won top awards at a libertarian conservative film festival over America and Atlas Shrugged. It took first place. And then the next week in Topanga Canyon in California, at a left-wing film festival, it took first place as well. So we've confused the circuitries on how to think about this, which is, I think, essential that we break down the political barriers to having a conversation. What I do have, and it will be here, this flyer invitation on the table gives some information, though watch it because the second address is wrong on the second night. It's going to be at the Bob Bullock IMAX Theater on the 25th, and then somewhere else on the 27th, so you have to go to the Austin Film Festival website to see what that location is. But I did bring a trailer with me, and it'll just take a few minutes. I just want to show that to you and then get into what I have to say.
Machiavelli said, the reason there will be no change is because the people who stand to lose from change have all the power. And the people who stand to gain from change have none of the power. That's describing the global aid system today.
I'm glad people want to help. It comes from a good heart. People give us food, they dig us wells, they bring us shoes, they encourage others to give.
We're going to make poverty history.
The problem is, it does not work.
The foreign aid amounted to a huge subsidy, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Tom Shoes found the right model that captured this love of people who want to be generous and helpful.
Our donations have an unpredictable impact on the local economy. Why would you go buy something? It's for free.
What happened to our cotton farms? That's all gone because of the negative impact of the imports at a second-hand level.
We rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries. It has not worked.
It actually created more poverty.
We don't need one more celebrity doing one more campaign. What we need is to no longer be excluded.
No one wants to be a beggar for life.
Emergency disaster relief has become a permanent model.
After 40 years, if you're still here, there's a problem.
I know about countries that developed on trade and innovation and business. I don't know of any country that got so much aid and it suddenly became a first world country.
If you really want to help, the poverty industry as we know it has to go.
The sooner we tell a beautiful story about the African entrepreneur doing amazing work, then we will begin to shift mindsets.
Her kids were in a horrible situation, but she started to work. And within 3 months, she had 10 employees of her own.
When you do something, you can see the impact on the population, and you can say, this is because of me.
Having a heart for the poor isn't hard, but having a mind for the poor, that's the challenge.
I warn you, it's quite provocative, and you'll enjoy it. You are to be commended for taking time to discuss the theme of this conference. It tells us that even as we live in a world where so much plagues us as societies, where poverty is contrasted with wealth, and where people who live in the midst of unprecedented wealth still feel a burden to think these questions through, that something, for all of the ills that exist, that something is essentially right. That you consider this important enough to contemplate and to understand emerges from the thing called solidarity. Solidarity is simply the recognition of the other in ourselves. We understand that we are not radically separate from the rest of the human family, and especially when we see human beings in want, in distressing situations, when we see them vulnerable and weak, that we identify with them, even if only to say, there but for the grace of God go I. But that you have gathered to contemplate this reality, and not just that, but also that you have gathered to talk about prosperity. Because after all, poverty is a reality that doesn't need a lot of explanation, right? If we do nothing, we're poor. The question is the antidote to it, and that is what prosperity is. Now, consider this fact, that you have had this wisdom to focus on prosperity in conjunction with poverty, understanding that there can be a remedy for this, that what has existed for most of human history as the norm need not exist in the next generations. We have found the solution. What needs to happen now is to apply it. Now, here's a heretical thought for you. I know some of you Baptists already thought I brought in my heretical thoughts anyway with my Roman collar, but be that as it may. But here's a heretical thought. 250 years ago, approximately, most of the world's population lived only slightly better than all of human history before that. And even the wealthy didn't live all that much better than the poor, especially if we compare it by our own lights today. Nor, on a practical level, did this reality change until new configurations began to take place in society itself. Today, we live on the top of the heap. And by that, I don't just mean the United States. Of course, we're up there. But by any available demographic study, portable water, caloric intake, access to medicines, education, medical care, shelter, clothing, by almost any standard that you want to examine the phenomenon of human material well-being, we are living on the top of the heap. I hasten to add, of course, that this doesn't mean that problems are all solved. We see desperate situations all over, but at the same time, we know something more today than they seem to have known 250 years ago about how to produce prosperity. Of course, there are a few places in the world where this hasn't been the case. Maybe all of those places where trade is restricted. Maybe Cuba, maybe North Korea is worse than generations before. But it's globalization of trade that has brought this about. Not all of the great and wonderful and admirable charitable programs, as important as they are, but not as normative solutions to the problem, but that act in emergency situations in a temporary way to get people out of immediate harm. But it hasn't been globalized charity. It hasn't been the UN and care packages. It hasn't been government-to-government aid. It's been simply the mundane, workaday world of labor, of work, and that being globalized that has enabled people to rise from the horrendous rates of poverty that existed throughout human history. It's the circles of exchange that St. John Paul II, who by the way, whose feast day is today, that he spoke about in his encyclical Centesimus Annus. It's the increasing division of labor that we see throughout the world and the technological advances that are themselves the result of that kind of increased division of labor and the lessening of restrictions of trade and research. These are realities that we have to confront, and confront soberly and courageously. When I was a seminarian, I was assigned, like seminarians are assigned, not only to study theology, but to engage in some very practical work. And I was studying at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. at the time. And my superiors listened to me and thought, where would you like to work? What would you like to do? What can help you? My first assignment was at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, where I worked with pediatric oncology and then with the first 20 patients who were undergoing an experimental drug at that time that turned out to be AZT. And then after I was done there, I was sent to Anacostia, which is the inner city of Washington, D.C. And my seminary classmate and I would take the metro out to Anacostia on Fridays. And there we would meet in the basement of a little Baptist church where there was a nun, quite entrepreneurial in her own right, who had begged food from all of the women's groups of the various churches in the suburbs of D.C. and Bethesda, Maryland, and Virginia, and all these different places. And she wrote them all letters, and she said, ladies, we'd like you to commit as a group once or twice a year to a common recipe, which you can prepare in your own homes, bring together, and bring down to us here so that we can feed people who come to us every Friday. She ran a soup kitchen. In my imagination, I pictured these ladies from the First Presbyterian Church of wherever, handing the recipes over to their cooks who prepared the meals, who then handed the finished product to their chauffeurs who brought them down to us in the inner city. I'm being too cynical there. But every Friday, my friend and I would show up, and we would set up all of the chairs in the basement of this Baptist church. We would take out the food that had been delivered from various sources, and we'd set it out on the tables. Now, the nun who was overseeing all of this said, now, guys, remember this. Whosoever will may come. Whoever comes, we feed. We don't ask any questions. We feed them. Now, who could argue with that? Whosoever will may come. It's even from the Bible. And so we did that. And over the weeks and months that we worked there, we naturally got to know some of the people. Usually we'd sit down, and once our work was done serving the food, we'd sit down and get acquainted with people, and I would see different things about their lives, all kinds of things. I remember one day as I was taking out some trash to throw away, the line was forming, and these two ladies arrived in a cab. And they got out of the cab and they rushed down, and I came down behind them, and they said, do you work here? I said, yeah. She said, could we get to the head of the line because there's a sale that we have to make? And they wanted to go first. And I scratched my head. But then the nun, you know, Catholic boys with nuns. Whosoever will may come. Don't ask any questions. So they ate and all of that. And one day, it was in the liturgical season of Lent. Now, in Lent, we don't eat meat on Fridays. Well, the Baptist ladies who sent us the lunch that day sent chili. So we served the chili, and we were done. We cleaned up everything, and we knew if we went back to the seminary right about then that the sisters would have already closed the kitchen. So I said, well, why don't we go right over here up the block? There's a little fish and chips shop right on the corner. Let's go in there. This is where I received a revelation. We walked into the fish and chips shop, and there was a man sweeping out the thing, and there was a girl cleaning off the tables. It looked like a father-daughter thing, and she took our order, and she slipped it through into the kitchen, and I could see the lady in the kitchen who looked like the mother frying up the fish and chips. And I'm sitting there as we're waiting for our order to be delivered, and I said to it took me a little while, but I finally summoned the courage to say to my seminarian classmate, you know, Joe, it dawns on me that we are this man's competition. And he said, what? I said, yeah, we might be doing more harm than good. He said, how can we be doing harm feeding people in this area? I said, well, this guy, did he take a loan out? Did he hawk his house to get this restaurant? He has to pay insurance, he has to pay light, he has to pay salaries, he has to pay all kinds of things, all of the stuff. I said, and we're set up a block away from him offering free food, and we pay for none of that. No insurance, no lights, not even the food. We don't even pay for the food. And then we don't even ask anybody when they're coming to do anything. We don't ask them to help set up. We don't help them clean up. We don't ask them to contribute something if they have it or to bring something. We do nothing. I said, now I'm not in favor of turning people who are really hungry away, but how do we know? We don't know. We allow them all to come in. I said, I just wonder. And he just shook his head at me. He said, you are crazy. And that thought, that epiphany, burned into my consciousness as I began to understand that the question of the necessity of food, the question of the necessity of work, centers on an understanding of the human person. And all too often we see the poor, the vulnerable, the disconnected as burdens who we have to help. We're all little Lady Bountifuls. We all want to love the poor. But what about loving the poor person? What about getting to know the person who is poor? And that's where it becomes complex. It's not complex in knowing what the solution to poverty is. The complexity is the particular circumstance of this person who comes to us in need. And taking the time and the patience, even if it's just rather than giving somebody money on the street, taking them to a McDonald's and having a cup of coffee with them and an Egg McMuffin. Because then you know a little bit more about that. And I know that that can be an awkward situation socially, because you never know who you're going to be ending up having lunch with. But I tell you, it's an enriching kind of thing. And this is why we produced this film, because I've had it with all of the platitudes and all of the posturing about poverty. You heard one of the commentators there say, we all have a heart for the poor. What about having a head for the poor? What about thinking about this problem? What about getting proximate to people who are in need? What about that? When we contemplate the reality of the human person, we come up with several understandings. And that is, the first is that we are all material. We're physical. We're created from the dust of the earth. We're placed into the context of scarcity. This is what gives rise to the whole question of economics. In the biblical understanding of it, we're endowed with an intelligence, with reason. And so our connection to the material world is more than just the connection that animals have to the material world, which is based on instinct. Our relation to the material world is based on intelligence. It's based on our reason. We can pull out from nature wealth. Wealth doesn't exist in a state of nature. Resources exist. Natural resources exist in a state of nature. But when we pull out from nature those resources and transform them in some way, we place them at the use of other people. That's when wealth comes into existence. When other people find value in what we have transformed in one way or another. By our labor, we have transformed the natural world, and it becomes of value, a subjective value, granted, because economic value is only subjective value. You can buy and sell all kinds of things, and they're not all good. Not all free market activity is good activity. I want to be real clear about that. Some is bad, some is good. Everything people do in their free and voluntary acting with one another will be seen on the market, because that's what the market is. That's all it is. It's not the panacea. Here's the second part of that anthropological insight I'm trying to emphasize, is that we are more than the dust of the earth. We have breathed into us the breath of life. That is, we're transcendent beings. Now, different people from different traditions are going to describe that in different ways, but I wager to say that even an honest, reasonable unbeliever has to believe in the capacity of human transcendence. Else you don't believe in beauty. You don't believe in love. You don't believe in heroism, because those are intangible realities that also constitute the human reality. So what I'm saying is that the economic truth of who we are as human beings on this planet is true. But it's not the only truth. Long ago, Marvin Olasky taught me to ignore the materialist assumption, which is operative in so many politicized and bureaucratized programs claiming to be on behalf of the poor. We are infinite beings. C.S. Lewis put it so beautifully. He describes this Judeo-Christian anthropology when he said, "You have never met a mere mortal." Everyone you have ever come in contact with, every shop girl from whom you've ever purchased anything, everyone you've ever loved or had a fight with is either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor. But you have never met a mere mortal. Then he went on to say, the most sacred thing that presents itself to our senses, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, is our neighbor. We have to understand the dignity of human beings. And we have failed utterly in all of these trillions and trillions of dollars that we have thrown at the poor, the majority of which Bob Woodson pointed out, isn't spent on the poor. I mean, none of you really believes that $10 million for a particular poverty program that's voted on in Washington, D.C. means $10 million in the pockets of the poor. You don't believe that, do you? No, there's the carrying price, right? All of the bureaucratic taxes on that too. But to come to understand that each person who presents itself to us has a destiny beyond this world and has the right of their own dignity by their very nature, not given to us by the state, not given to us by government, not given to us by the greatest constitution ever written in this world, but in that great constitution is simply recognized as de facto, that it comes with the nature of the case. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, so that the function of government is to protect those rights when it's functioning well. The government can obfuscate those rights. It can attempt to take them from us. It can violate them, but it can never give them to us. And I suggest to you that if we want to understand the question that's posed as the theme of this conference, that the first place to begin is to understand the human person. The argument is first and foremost not a policy argument. It's not even an economic argument. It is an anthropological question. And unless we have this veneration for the poor, for the vulnerable, for the disabled, for all of those who in any circumstance of life find themselves in an arduous circumstance, unless we understand that, then we don't understand ourselves. And we sure as heck are not going to understand how to help people step out of that. We must stop seeing human vulnerability as an object of our charity. We must see it as an opportunity to allow people to live self-determined lives for the very reason that they have a destiny beyond this world which they will only discover by having the freedom and the capacity to search out that destiny themselves. When we began this film that we produced, we outlined a number of principles. You may never have put them this way, but I suspect that most all of you in this room would resonate very clearly with them. We believe that it's time to move from aid to enterprise. We believe it's time to move from poverty alleviation to wealth creation, from paternalism to partnerships, from handouts to investments, from seeing the poor as consumers or burdens to seeing them as creators, from viewing people and economics as experiments to pursuing solidarity with the poor, from viewing the poor as recipients of charity to acknowledging them as agents of change with dignity, capacity, and creativity. From encouraging dependency to integrating the poor into networks of productivity and exchange. From subsidies and protectionism to open trade and competition. From seeing the global economy as a fixed pie to understanding that human enterprise can grow economics. All of this can be summed up in one brief, very memorable anthropological observation made again by St. John Paul II in that encyclical I mentioned. Man is man's greatest resource. And if we leave the human person, including the poor, outside of this equation, we will be at this over and over and over again, and Bono will never go out of business. We have to change the whole terms of the debate. And that's why I think the undertaking that the Texas Public Policy Foundation is doing now with this new initiative with regard to poverty will resonate with people because we know it to be true. We know it in our bones to be true. You know, when I was a kid back in Brooklyn, I remember we kids, at least the boys, mostly played stickball. Stickball is an abbreviated version of baseball, right? It's kind of reconfigured to fit narrow Brooklyn streets. And you play it with a mop handle or a broomstick, a little Spalding ball, and the one manhole cover, the sewer cover, was home plate. Some 1950s Rambler was first base. The other sewer cover was second, and then third was the Deering's station wagon. The Deerings were an Irish Catholic family, so they needed a station wagon. And we played this game on the street and only kind of scatter when cars were coming through, but then we would play this game. And now there were 10, 15 boys screaming and carrying on, and sitting up on her stoop, that's Brooklyn for porch, was Mrs. Rabinowitz. Mrs. Rabinowitz was an old, somewhat nosy Jewish lady who sat there and watched the neighborhood. My mother used to call her the mayor of the neighborhood. And Mrs. Rabinowitz would survey up and down, and if we got too excited, if we were using words we oughtn't to be using, her mouth would go off like an alarm. And it would contain one word, Robert. And Joe and Dan and all the other kids would freeze. She'd say, I see you. I'm going to tell your mother. Now I ask you, seriously think about this. In what inner city would a little old lady have the audacity to sit on a porch and tell 15 boys from that inner city to behave themselves? And if you have that picture in your mind, ask yourself what has happened to our society. That Mrs. Rabinowitz could govern those kids without government, whereas today it would take squad cars to come in and put down the ruckus. What happened was a common set of values, a common understanding, and we were very different people. She was obviously Jewish, I was Catholic, who was Protestant, who was nothing, who was this, who was that. Different races, but a common set of values. This core, indeed this American ideal, this principle upon which this great nation was built, needs to be restored. The foundation is one of the essential organizations, all the more important because you're in one of the largest and most successful states, is one of the organizations helping to rebuild and re-nurture that core. I thank you for your support for this organization and encourage you to continue it, Because together, whether we are in Texas or in Michigan or in New York or, God help us, even California, there are people laboring in this same vineyard. And at some point, as we build our groups, we're going to hit a critical mass. And it's going to come by communicating these kind of basic understandings which we share in this room, but we need to expand to our fellow Americans. I want to leave you with just one more insight. I think this insight, more than any other economist I've ever read, more than any other sociologist I've ever studied, devastates the whole Marxian notion of class struggle. Because, you know, when you hear words like the war on poverty, what you're really talking about is a class struggle. That the norm for society is to be in perpetual conflict, and that there are winners and losers, and that whole model. But if we can come to understand that society, in its normal state, does not have to be at war with one another, but that there can be a harmonization of interests, as Bastiat spoke about in his wonderful book, Economic Harmonies. I think if we can come to this understanding again, that we'll have that common core of values that can be the beginning of a renaissance of the values that we hold so dear. And that person who devastated the Marxist argument was none other than Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who made this observation. She said, "We have no right to condemn the rich. We do not believe in class warfare, but in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich." Thank you very much. Thank you.
Father, thank you so much. And just one final note. You said at the beginning there, "But for the grace of God, go I." I would like to change that to, "There, but for the grace of God, go we," as we continue this work. And with your wisdom and guidelines and comments intact, it is an extraordinary gift to continue what you said and your work. So I thank you for that. And I thank you all for being here. And I would just say, stay tuned. So thank you.